All right, here we are in part 2 of the portrait retouch demo. I've opened up our second demo image. This is an image made by a student of mine, and I think nicely done. This model in the image has really nice smooth skin, just a few little lines and things. And though that may not seem like much, it still may be part of our job in the future to still retouch this. So let's go through a few steps that we've already done and then build on that. The first thing I'm going to do is zoom in a bit, and I'm going to duplicate this layer. And as we did before, I'm going to call it Retouch Blemishes. And we'll do a little bit of full retouching. In other words, we're going to make these blemishes completely gone. There's not a whole lot to do here, and I'm going to do this really quickly so we can move on to our other new things that we're going to learn. I've got a little bit of a long hair here that I'm going to try to get rid of with a steady hand. And we get the basic idea. Now I'm going to add, I'm going to duplicate that layer, and this will be Retouch Lines, and we have very few lines, but just to build on what we've done before. And then we're going to go through here and get rid of a few lines. We're doing this on a separate layer, which will allow us to now bring back a little bit of that if we want to. A few little lines on the neck. And we can now go to the Retouch Lines layer and reduce the opacity of that layer so that we see back a little bit of those lines and not have them completely gone. At this point, what I'm going to do is add a layer to smooth the skin just a little bit. And to do this, I'm going to create a composite of all of the visible layers that I currently have. So basically I want to take all these three layers, kind of make a merged composite, but have it up as its own separate layer. And there's a few ways you can do that. The way that I'm really comfortable with is a keystroke, a complex keystroke that's Shift, Option, Command, and E all together. But you could also go to the Layer pop-out menu. Sorry, it's difficult to see this here. And I'm going to go to Merge Visible, but I'm going to hold down the Option key when I do it. And I'm going to keep that key held down until I see that new layer appear. That new layer is a composite of all of these lower layers. I'm going to simply double click on layer 1, the name, and call that composite. Now what am I doing with this composite? What I'm going to do is take this area of the face and lift it up to its own layer. To do that, I'm going to go to the quick mask mode, and I'm always going to double click that and make sure that's on selected areas and activate that quick mask mode. I'm going to paint with a brush. I want my paintbrush tool here. Paintbrush tool at 100% opacity and 100% flow. I'm going to paint the face plus a little bit extra around the outside. I kind of want a little bit of a harder brush than that. So paint around the face plus a little bit extra around a little bit of the hair, a little bit below the chin. That's fine. If you want, you could do all the way down to the neck, to the top of the shirt. Okay, and when I exit the quick mask mode, that now becomes a selection. What I'm going to do is jump that face, the part that I've selected, up to its own layer, and I'm going to do that with a simple keystroke of Command J. If you're on Windows, that would be Control J. And you see here that now in the layers palette, I have that layer as its own separate layer, or that section as its own separate layer. And I'm going to rename that layer Skin Smoothing. What we're going to do with this layer is we're going to use a blur. I'm going to go to the filter menu down to blur and over to Gaussian blur. It's a very simple little blur. All it just has is one little slider. Now, initially you might think, oh, that's way too blurred. I don't want to do that much, but we're going to reduce this amount of blur later. So I'm going to choose something maybe 5 pixels or so. I'm going to click OK. That's very significantly blurred. Yes, it is. But what I'm going to now do is take the opacity of that layer down. And as I do, you start to see a little bit of the sharper detail through it, a little bit of the texture of the skin. I'm going to take that down all the way to about 1/4 opacity, so 25% opacity. Here's before, here's with it. You see just a little bit of softening of the skin, but it doesn't look quite right because the eyes look like they're kind of fuzzy, hazy. I want to see some detail there. I want to see some detail on the lips, maybe around the nose, the nostril edge, the eyebrows. So those are areas that my eye expects to see sharp detail with good contrast, good local contrast. And what I'm going to do to still see that and keep the smoother parts of the skin smooth is I'm going to add a layer mask, which I can do down here by clicking this button right here to add a layer mask. And while I've got that layer mask active, if I take black as my foreground color and a paintbrush, and I'm just going to do this at full opacity, but you don't have to. You could bring it in at lower opacity. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go over areas that I feel where I should see the detail. I'm going over this with black on the mask, and what that's doing is it's revealing the unblurred layer below it. This would be my composite layer. And so where I can now see those sharper details, it really convinces the viewer's eye that the areas that are softened by the blur are really that way, and areas that have detail look nice and sharp and detailed. So I'm going to go over areas like the eyebrows, around the eyes, around the nostrils of the nose, the lips where we would expect to see good sharp detail, all of these areas. And now what we're going to do is one more little step that gets kind of to what we're going to do in part 3, which is I'm going to change the color of the lips just a little bit, and this introduces using curves for color. So let's just imagine that this is something you're doing for a client. It's for a cosmetics ad. Client calls back and says the lips need to be more magenta. Okay, whether you agree with that decision or not, this is now your job. So what we're going to do is use that same task, that same technique we just did to select the face. I'm going to use the quick mask mode here with my brush, with black as my foreground color, 100% opacity, and I'm going to paint the lips. Now we see a red overlay. That's not actually the color we're going to produce. That's just an indicator that this will become a selection. And I'm going to kind of rough it out at first, and then I might zoom in a little bit and come in a little closer and get that just a bit more accurately selected or painted. It will become a selection in a minute. Okay, good enough. We can always refine that later if we need to. Now if I back up a little bit and I exit the quick mask mode, that is now a selection. So any adjustment layer that I create will only affect that area. It will come with a mask specifically for that area. And the adjustment layer that I'm going to pick is curves. Now in this case, I want to affect the color of the lips. So I'm not going to switch my blending mode from normal to luminosity, but I may switch it from normal to color, so I'm only affecting the color. You might decide that you want to affect the color and the luminosity, in which case you may leave it as normal. If I want to make those lips more magenta, what I'm going to do is go into a particular color channel that would affect magenta. But as you see, there is no magenta color channel. Now, red is kind of like magenta, so I suppose I could go into red and start boosting that, but what I get is more red lips. I could then maybe go also into blue and start boosting blue, and now I get more magenta because I've increased both red and blue. The two of them make up magenta. Now I'm going to undo that for a second and undo what I did in the red channel to show you that I could also go to green. Green is the complement or opposite of magenta, and what I could do is pull down green, and as I pull down green, I as a result get more magenta. So that may be a simpler way of doing it. And there I have more magenta lips. At this point I would save off the layered Photoshop file and move along. And we will move to part 3.